policy, polity, and politics, which in most Slavic languages, the fine distinctions between these three are very difficult to grasp, and translators are still struggling with that. The whole vocabulary of rights, of course, everything that has to do with inclusion, recognition, equality, autonomy, discrimination, the whole vocabulary of social care and social security, and you name it, just every single social sphere got these new concepts through translation. Now, of course, in that process, there were mistranslations taking place as well. And I'll just give you a concrete example and then I'll stop so that we can continue. I haven't talked about the publishing situation per se, but maybe we can do that later. So through this process of appropriating new words for the new realities, had, of course, its glorious moments, but also there were many mistranslations and misinterpretations that still have, I believe, direct consequences on the way people think about their social situation. And let me just give you an example with the word gender. Not because I'm a woman, but I think it's a key. This is a key notion from the 20th century, from the 60s of the 20th century. That was one of these key concepts that get into East European languages via translation, and there were basically three strategies in different countries that translators would take for translating gender into East European languages. Kaya, maybe you can tell me how you do that in Latvian. But one was to simply transliterate it. And instead of gender, so in Serbian they would say gender, and in Russian they would say gender. But this was a simple transliteration, which means that the word still, until nowadays, I believe, remains alien and remains foreign in any given text, or whenever it's even used, when it's used orally. The second strategy was to translate it literary, using the same words that is used for the gender as grammatical category, which again produces the same effect of confusion and total misunderstanding of what the political forces behind the word gender are. And the third strategy, again, unfortunately, twisting the whole meaning of the word, that some translators, especially in Bulgaria, took, was to come up to coin neologisms, such as, in the Bulgarian case, something that would sound like socio-sex. So, in that sense, like the Bulgarian translation of the famous book by Judith Butler, the Gender Trouble, if I retranslate it back into English, the title would sound something like the challenges of the social sex. Of course, I mean, it's not about social sex. And I believe, I mean, it's a bit of an overstatement, but I believe that using that example with gender, the situation with women movements, if you wish, with women's rights, with the public talk about women's rights and gender issues, is remains somehow, I mean, the whole talk remains somehow alien to these cultures nowadays, also because the inability of the translators to properly introduce this concept into the local languages. Yeah.
Yeah, you have a question?
Yes. Could you just go a little bit more
more detail into title selection? So how
for the funding program?
Right, and then how the decision is made, which languages are it's going to be that title is going to be translated into?
It was a bit more complicated than that. The Soros foundations in Eastern Europe had offices in each country, so each country would run its own independent grants program, in which publishers would apply with titles of their own choice. I mean, we had a list of recommended titles. That was a list of 500 the greatest books in humanities and social sciences, but this was not restrictive. Like, publishers could apply with titles from the list or outside from the list, as long as they are translations in humanities and social sciences. And then there were, in each country, there were local committees that would decide on the applications. But this is, I mean, this was running from, in some countries, since 1992 up until 2004.
So, can I follow? So maybe 5 different countries, are selecting maybe the same book from that list, and then that book will be translated into those.
Yeah, but because publishers are applying, publishers are taking care of the translation. The grants go to publishers. Grants are calculated on the basis of budgets presented by the publishers, and grants would cover sometimes up to 80% of the whole budget of per title. So there was not, I mean, I guess your question implies that there was some kind of a central office translating these things. No, there was, grants would go to publishers. Publishers were taking care for selecting the translators, dealing with copyright, etc.
Yeah, no, actually, it was just, I just wondered, the mechanics of it.
It was complicated. Distributing grants at such a large scale, it's very complicated, but I think it was done fair enough.
I want to ask you about the publishers. It's always interesting talking to someone who is in another country that deals with the issue of translation, because everything's like flipped upside down. Like, here we have the problem, you can't get any funding. The government funding is like, the NEA is fantastic and wonderful and does a lot of great things, but it's still like a tiny budget compared to like the greater scheme of things, and nothing like the EU's $200 million or 200 million euros. What is it? 2 million. You make that 200 million. Go EU. 2 million. That's still a lot of money. It's still huge. And like the interest in getting things translated is completely different. Like, I remember when I was in Bulgaria earlier in May or whatever for a fiction workshop, and met a number of publishers, and they were saying that we were talking about how few translations there are in America, the whole 3% thing. And they're like, well, yeah, it's flipped here. It's like 97% because we never had any Bulgarian fiction writers. Like, no one wrote fiction. No one wrote novels. So the only way a publishing company could survive was to be importing and translating all this stuff. And then then I want to hear what you say, but the other funny, weird thing was, I was talking about how publishers in America are now trying to like become more reader-centric and talk more to their customers and get to know who their fan base is and who is supporting them as publishers. And one guy in the room that was like, oh yeah, I'm a publisher in Bulgaria. He's like, I know all of my readers. I know all 5 of them by sight. Like, they're actually like my friends. So it's like a completely different scenario. But I'd like to hear what your take on it. My like outsider foreign vision is probably like skewed and weird. So.
What is my vision on what?
What is publishing like? What are the publishing companies like? How does it work in Bulgaria?
It's not only in Bulgaria, like, yes, it's not 97% of translations, but it's up to, it was like around 50% in the 90s, but it's going down now. So the percentage of translations out of the overall book production would be between 25 and 40%. in all those countries from Bulgaria to including Serbia, Slovenia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, etc. And most of these translations are indeed fiction, and most of them are from English. You know that it's up to 60% of them are from English. And the second most translated language is German, in some countries French. But the second language would take about 10% of the translations. So imagine, like, number one is English with 60, and then the next best is with 10%.
Why is that?
Good question. I knew you were going to ask that. Well, first, there are many more translators from English than from any other language. I guess I guess it's because of the dominance of the American mass culture. That makes it sort of easier to and more recognizable, so to say.
So, which question?
Yeah. Part of the problem, I guess, with translation culture in America is that people, like, we've talked about this a lot, that people who take a translated book will be like, oh, it's been translated, like, they don't want to know about that, and publishers have to hide it, whereas if more, 50% or more, and this is true in most European countries, they're reading a lot more books in translation just by sheer closeness of contact, and I wondered what's the difference between the perspective of the point of view of translated books in Bulgaria versus the attitude here, which is very much anti.
Yeah, it's simply completely opposite attitude. The fact that a book is a translation makes it
good.
Yeah, even more than that, it makes it more reliable somehow. Like, it's coming from outside, so makes people actually buy it. And you have to, convince the book buyers that a Bulgarian content is worth spending money on, whereas for translations it can be any trash. You don't have to justify.
Why is that?
Particularly for fiction, because as Chad just said, there hasn't been somehow the fiction writers could not cope with the transition, so to speak. I mean, it took a whole 15 years until people started actually writing good quality fiction after the end of socialism. Poetry was much more, I don't know why is that. Maybe it takes longer for fiction writers to kind of find their place in the new environment. I don't know.
Well, I have two thoughts on that. One is, it's interesting that we have, like, the Faulkner being translated into Spanish at some point in time, influencing Sayre, and Sayre coming back into English now is like a sort of almost circular sort of influence. But with that, when you say, like, good fiction writers, do you mean that they're sort of good in terms of, like, compared to American writers and following the sort of American dominant realist aesthetic, or just, like, capable?
No, I don't think. Do you think, like, in terms of good American writers, or good writers are good. Good writers are good writers, right? No matter the language they write.
Oh yeah, I know what you mean. But, like, if there's so many American books that are being translated into Eastern Europe and Eastern European languages, there is a sort of aesthetic or a sort of dominant, like, way of writing books, a way of, like, describing and depicting, and, like, that aesthetic comes through. If that's what's influencing, is that what's influencing Bulgarian writers? They're trying to, like, mimic and be like those American writers, or is there something different going on?
No, I don't think. They have the whole world literature tradition